https://www.youtube.com/watch?v equals UKFK1F1G_HY 10ken K-Chin Honor Stories. Link video https://www.youtube.com/watch. $V equals UKFK1F1G_HY Tuesday. Rich kids bullied a woman in wheelchair and hurt her dog until a Marines K9 stepped in. Tuesday TV. Rich kids bắt nạt một người phụ nữ ngồi trên xe lăn và làm bị thương con chó của cô ấy, cho đến khi K9 của lính thủy đánh bồ bước vào. Thời lượng 47 phút 42 giây. View 22.228.
Military configuration, flying low over the roof of Stonebridge Medical Center like they owned the airspace. And in the stunned silence that followed, someone near the reception desk whispered what everyone else was already thinking. Who did they just throw out of this building? If you've stayed this long, stay until the end, because this story is only getting started. Hit like, follow along, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Olivia Hart was 31 years old and had been a nurse at Stonebridge Medical Center for 14 months. That was the version of her story that existed on paper, on her employment file, on her badge, on the schedule board in the ER break room where someone had drawn a small frown face next to her name in permanent marker. She had noticed it 3 weeks ago and hadn't said anything. That was also part of the story, the part where she noticed things and said nothing. She'd come to Stonebridge from out of state. No connections, no references anyone recognized, just clean certifications and a work history that was oddly thin for someone her age. She told the hiring coordinator she'd spent several years in federal contract work and that some of it was restricted. The coordinator had blinked at that and moved on to the next line of the form. Nobody pressed. Nobody was particularly curious about Olivia Hart because Olivia Hart did not demand to be noticed. She showed up for every shift. She charted carefully. She didn't complain in the break room or angle for better assignments or make alliances with the nurses who ran the social hierarchy of the floor. She was just there, quiet and competent, and that made her easy to dismiss and harder to read than anyone around her realized. The ER at Stonebridge was a 32-bed department serving a city of 200,000 people, and it ran the way most underfunded urban ERs ran, on exhaustion and improvisation and the quiet heroism of staff who'd stopped expecting anyone upstairs to notice. Dr. Randall Poe was the department's senior attending, a man of 53 who wore his authority like a coat he'd had since residency and never updated. He was not cruel exactly. He was just the particular kind of tired that makes people reflexively resistant to anything that challenges their existing framework. Olivia had clashed with him twice in her first month. After that, she'd learned to work around him, which was its own skill. The nursing staff sorted themselves into predictable camps. Dara Sims was charge nurse on evening shifts and made no secret of her opinion that Olivia was cold and probably hiding something. Marcus Ewan, who worked days and overlapped with Olivia twice a week, was the only one who regularly talked to her without an agenda. He'd bring her coffee sometimes and ask questions he actually wanted answers to, and Olivia had come to appreciate him in the quiet way she appreciated things that worked correctly. But the person who mattered most to the shape of Olivia's days at Stonebridge was a man she'd never met until 6 weeks before everything fell apart. His name was Clifton Brewer, and he was admitted through the ER on a Thursday afternoon with what looked like complications from a chronic lung condition. He was 61, heavy-set, with the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of something harder than ordinary life. He was polite to the nurses and evasive with the doctors, and he had no emergency contacts listed on his intake form, which Olivia noted because she noted everything. She wasn't his assigned nurse. She took him on because the nurse who was supposed to have him was double booked, and Brewer had been sitting in Bay 4 for 40 minutes without anyone checking his oxygen saturation, which had dropped to 89% while he sat there alone. She walked in, took one look at his color, and started working. That was the first time. After that, she kept gravitating back to him between her own assignments, not because she'd decided to. She wasn't someone who made dramatic decisions about things. It was more that he was there, and something about his chart didn't add up, and she couldn't make herself stop looking at it. His admitting diagnosis was COPD exacerbation. The labs told a slightly different story. Not wildly different, but enough that Olivia had flagged it to Dr. Poe on a Friday afternoon, presenting the discrepancy carefully and without drama. Poe had glanced at the page for about 4 seconds. It's within normal variance for his age and condition. The troponin trend concerns me, she said. It concerns you, he repeated, in the tone he used when he wanted to end a conversation. I've documented it. Good. Go document something else. She documented it again the following Tuesday, this time including a note comparing the values across 3 separate draws. The charge nurse that day, a woman named Patricia who was close with Poe, told her she was creating unnecessary noise in the chart and that the attending had already reviewed the case. Olivia said nothing and documented that interaction too. Brewer, for his part, didn't say much about his health. He said other things, slow, careful things, like a man who'd spent a lot of time measuring his words before releasing them. He asked her once if she'd ever worked anywhere unusual. She said she'd worked in a few different settings. He nodded at that, like it confirmed something he'd suspected. She asked him once about his work history, and he looked at the ceiling for a long moment before saying he'd been in logistics. The way he said it was the same way she'd described federal contract work to the hiring coordinator, the same deliberate vagueness. She recognized it because it was hers. She didn't ask again. She just kept watching his numbers. The situation with the record started in the second week of October. Olivia was pulling a double when she noticed a discrepancy between what was in Brewer's physical chart and what had been entered in the electronic system. It wasn't the kind of error that happened by accident. A specific lab value had been changed, a different number substituted cleanly for the original, and the timestamp on the revision had been set for a time when she knew for a fact the system had been accessed by someone with attending level clearance. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went to the charge nurse's station, wrote out exactly what she'd found, referenced the original values, and noted the discrepancy in a formal record. She didn't accuse anyone of anything. She just described what the numbers said. The next morning, she was pulled into a meeting with Dr. Nolan Greer, the hospital's chief medical officer. Greer's office was on the 4th floor, carpeted, with a view of the parking structure. He was in his late 50s, lean, with silver hair that looked professionally managed, and a manner that suggested he'd spent decades in rooms where he was always the most important person present. He did not offer her a seat. She sat anyway. You filed a chart discrepancy report, he said. I did. Against an attending physician. Against a data entry, she said. The numbers don't match. That's a documentation error, and it needs to be corrected. Greer looked at her for a moment with an expression she'd seen before on men in positions of institutional power, a kind of flat, calibrated patience that wasn't patience at all. Nurse Hart, I'm going to be direct with you. The chart has been reviewed. The entry is consistent with the attending's clinical notes. Then the clinical notes don't match the lab draw. Are you questioning Dr. Poe's documentation? I'm questioning a number that changed after the fact. There was a pause. Greer picked up a pen he didn't use, set it down. This is not a productive use of your energy or this department's time. I'm asking you to withdraw the report and let the attending manage his patients. Olivia said, I can't withdraw an accurate observation. The meeting ended shortly after that. She went back to her shift and kept working. 4 days later, Brewer's condition deteriorated sharply overnight. Olivia wasn't on shift when it happened. She came in at 7 to find him on a ventilator, his chart showing a cascade of events that the night team had managed as best they could. She stood at the foot of his bed for a moment, reading the notes, and then she read them again because something was missing. A medication that should have been administered at 2300 hours had been logged as given, but the bag was still sealed in the supply cart when she checked. She documented that too. At 9:15, Dr. Poe found her in the hallway outside Bay 4. You're inserting yourself into a case that isn't yours, he said. He kept his voice low, but there was an edge in it she hadn't heard from him before. I'm documenting what I'm observing. You're creating liability exposure over a charting timeline that has already been reviewed. He didn't receive the medication, she said. Poe's jaw tightened. You're accusing a night nurse of falsifying records. I'm saying the bag wasn't open. That's not an accusation. That's a physical fact. She held his gaze. If it was an oversight, then it should be corrected. If it wasn't an oversight, stop. He moved half a step closer. I'm telling you, as the senior attending in this department, that you are creating problems where none exist. Stay in your lane, Nurse Hart. She didn't look away. My lane is patient safety. He walked off. She went back to work. The next 72 hours were quiet in the specific way that precedes something. Nobody was outright hostile, but things shifted. She got the worst assignments 3 days running. Her locker was moved without explanation. When she sat in the break room, conversations changed. Dara Sims stopped making eye contact with her, which was almost more telling than outright confrontation. Marcus found her in the stairwell on a Wednesday afternoon, eating a sandwich she hadn't had time to eat during the shift. You know people are talking, he said. I figured. Poe's been in Greer's office twice this week. She took another bite. Okay. Olivia. He waited until she looked at him. I don't know what's in that chart, and I'm not asking, but whatever you found, someone doesn't want you to have found it. I know. Is it worth it? She thought about Brewer, about the way he'd measured his words so carefully, about the sealed medication bag. Yeah, she said. It is. Marcus looked at her for a moment, then nodded once and went back upstairs. She filed a formal report with the state nursing board the following morning, routing it through the external portal rather than the internal system. She noted the chart discrepancy, the medication inconsistency, and the 2 conversations with Poe and Greer in which she'd been asked, explicitly and implicitly, to let the matter go. She kept the language factual and the documentation clean. Then she went to work her shift. It was a busy afternoon, 2 ambulance arrivals, a pediatric trauma, a sepsis case that needed hands. She was in the middle of hanging a second-line antibiotic when Dr. Greer appeared in the ER doorway. He was not a man who came to the ER. He stood there in his 4th-floor clothes with his professionally maintained hair and looked at her across the room, and she understood with a kind of tired clarity that something had been decided. He waited until she'd finished the drip before approaching, which she granted him. My office. Now. I have 3 patients on active monitoring. Now, Nurse Hart. She made sure Marcus knew to cover her patients and followed Greer upstairs. The office had more people in it this time. Poe was there, standing near the window. The hospital's director, a man named Warren Holt, was sitting in the chair Greer usually occupied. Holt ran Stonebridge Medical Center with the energy of someone who thought of healthcare primarily as a revenue stream, and he had the smooth committee room manner that came with years of institutional maneuvering. He was 50, well-dressed, and he looked at Olivia with an expression that had already decided the outcome before she sat down. She didn't sit. We've completed a review of your recent conduct, Greer began. The review took 3 days, she said. And your pattern of behavior, he continued, as if she hadn't spoken, constitutes a serious breach of professional protocols. Filing external reports without exhausting internal channels, making repeated unsubstantiated allegations against senior physicians. They were substantiated, she said. I have the original lab values and the medication log. Holt cleared his throat. Those records have been reviewed and cleared. By the same people I reported. That's enough. Holt's voice had dropped to the register that men like him used when they wanted to make it clear that the performance of patients was over. Nurse Hart, you came to this hospital 14 months ago with a thin employment history and no institutional relationships. In that time, you've created conflict with attending physicians, disrupted department morale, and now you've filed an external board complaint against this facility. He paused. We're letting you go. Something went very still in her chest. Effective immediately, he continued. You'll surrender your badge and credentials to Human Resources. Security will escort you from the building. There's a patient in Bay 4, she said. He's ventilated and his medication protocol will be handled by his assigned team. He doesn't have an assigned team. He's been falling through the cracks of this floor for 2 weeks, which is what I've been documenting. You're no longer employed here. Holt stood, buttoned his jacket. Leave your badge and go. She looked at Poe, who was studying the window. She looked at Greer, who was watching his own hands. She looked back at Holt, who held her gaze with practiced certainty, and she thought about everything she could say, every argument she could make, and she understood with cold clarity that none of it would matter in this room, to these men, today. She unclipped her badge, set it on the desk, walked out. The security guards were already waiting in the hallway. 2 of them, professional and impersonal, 1 on each side. They walked her to the elevator, down through the main corridor, through the emergency wing lobby, and she kept her eyes forward and her breathing even. A few nurses looked up. Most looked away. Dara Sims was behind the charge desk and didn't turn around. Marcus was coming around the corner from the supply room and stopped dead when he saw her. She shook her head, once, slightly, and he stood there holding a box of IV supplies with an expression on his face like she'd just told him something terrible in a language he barely spoke. The security guard on her left put his hand on her arm to steer her around a gurney that had just come through the ambulance bay doors, and that was when the alarm went off. Not a code call, something different, a hard, rolling emergency tone, the kind the hospital used for mass casualty events. She stopped. The guard on her left said, "Keep moving." The ambulance radio near the bay crackled open. Multiple vehicle accident on the Carver Street overpass, initial reports of 30 or more casualties, EMS saturated, all available hospitals activated. Then a second transmission, almost on top of the first. Structural collapse at a construction site on the east side. Trapped workers, number unknown. The emergency wing, already running at 90%, immediately spiked into something that wasn't controlled chaos. It was just chaos. Gurneys started moving, the overhead PA started calling codes. She could hear voices rising, someone calling for blood from the bank, someone else saying the trauma bay wasn't prepped. The guard on her right said, "Ma'am, we need to go." She stood in the middle of the lobby and looked through the wide glass panel into the ER. She could see exactly what was happening because she'd trained for exactly this. Trauma patients were coming in through 2 different doors simultaneously with no clear triage order. A nurse she didn't know well was trying to manage 3 gurneys with no directing physician visible. The pediatric bay had the curtain pulled, but a machine beeped from inside it in a rhythm that meant someone needed intervention immediately. "Ma'am." The guard put his hand on her shoulder. She looked at his hand, then at him. "Take your hand off me," she said quietly. Something in her voice made him do it. She pushed through the doors. "Hey!" one of them called behind her. She walked to the pediatric bay first because that was the most immediate. Pulled the curtain. A 6-year-old boy, blunt trauma, parents frantic in the corner, a nurse pressing on the wrong site. Olivia calmly moved the nurse's hands, repositioned the pressure, told the mother in a level voice to hold that spot and not let go, and called across the floor for a specific instrument kit by name and catalog number. It came. She moved to the unsorted gurneys next, starting triage with the efficiency of someone running on muscle memory, making calls in seconds that the staff around her couldn't have made in minutes, because what she was doing now was not nursing. It was something older and faster, something learned in conditions that didn't exist in any civilian emergency department, and her hands remembered all of it before her mind had fully decided to be here. "Who are you?" someone said. "Olivia Hart. Get me a second trauma bay, and I need your most senior surgical resident right now." "She was just fired," someone else said. "Then she's fired in triaging. Which patient do you want me to put down?" She looked at the person who'd said it, a young resident, pale, sweating. "Because I've got 4 critical and 2 stable, and the critical ones have about 6 minutes before the window closes. So tell me what you want." The resident pointed at the critical 4. She nodded and kept moving. For the next 40 minutes, Olivia Hart worked that emergency room like she was the only person in it who knew where the walls were in the dark. She wasn't loud. She wasn't running. She moved at the pace of controlled authority, speaking in short, clear sentences, making decisions without hesitation, handing off to the right people when the right people were ready, keeping everything moving forward in the cascade of incoming need. A man arrived with a crushed chest and no blood pressure, and she called the procedure before the attending had finished reading the monitor. "You can't do that," the attending said. "I just did. Get me the tray." He got the tray. 2 more ambulances. A woman in cardiac arrest. A teenager with a penetrating injury that looked dramatic but wasn't the priority. And an older man with a quiet injury that absolutely was. She sorted them correctly, without hesitation. Warren Holt appeared at the edge of the floor at some point. She clocked him peripherally, saw his expression shift through several stages of something complicated as he watched her work. She had no time and no interest in his expression. Then the building shook, not a tremor, a percussive compression wave, air and sound and vibration together. Every window in the emergency wing rattled, the overhead fluorescents flickered, and through the large plate glass panels of the trauma bay, visible against the darkening sky, lights swept across the parking lot in rhythmic arcs. Rotor wash, cloak, and getting closer. The radio on the wall near the ambulance bay crackled, air traffic control clearing the hospital's rooftop pad for military approach, multiple aircraft, then 3 more, then the thudding of rotors directly overhead, deep and organized, not the chaotic chop of a single emergency flight, but the coordinated approach of a deliberate operation. Olivia kept working. She had a patient on the table, but she felt it, that particular shift in the air, the way a room changes when something that can't be undone has just begun. The double doors at the end of the corridor opened. He was in tactical field gear, no rank insignia visible from a distance, but carrying himself the way men who didn't need insignia carried themselves. He was in his mid-40s, built like someone who had never let circumstance take anything from him that he wasn't willing to give. 2 more operators flanked him, also in field configurations, scanning the room with the practiced neutrality of people who assess threats and spaces simultaneously. He stopped inside the door, looked across the floor. His gaze moved past Holt, past Poe, past the nursing station, moved through the controlled movement and noise and organized urgency of the emergency room, and stopped. On Olivia Hart. He said something to one of the operators beside him. The operator nodded and touched an earpiece. Then the commander walked forward, directly through the middle of the floor, past gurneys and staff who parted instinctively, not because they'd been told to, but because something about his movement made them step aside without thinking about it. He stopped 3 feet from her. She looked up from the patient she was stabilizing. He looked at her for one moment with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not surprise, not relief exactly. Something more complex. Something that had history in it. "Hart," he said. "Commander?" she said. And every person in the emergency room who was not currently in the middle of saving a life stopped what they were doing and looked at the 2 of them, standing across from each other in the middle of the chaos, speaking to each other like people who had once shared something that no paperwork had ever fully captured. Warren Holt, standing at the edge of the floor where he'd come to see what was happening and possibly reassert control, watched this exchange. The color in his face had gone somewhere it wasn't coming back from easily. Olivia turned back to her patient, finished what she was doing, handed off to the nurse beside her with clear instructions, and then straightened up and faced the commander fully. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Still unfolding," he said. "Second collapse site, possible gas line. We've got additional casualties inbound." He paused, looked at her with the directness of someone who needed information and intended to get it. "You running this floor right now?" She glanced at Holt. Holt's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Working on it," she said. The commander looked at Holt, then back at Olivia. The question in his expression was not really a question. "She was terminated this evening," Holt said. His voice had found itself, barely. "She's not authorized to be in this department." The commander turned to look at him fully for the first time. The pause that followed was very quiet for a room full of machines and people. "Say that again," the commander said. Warren Holt said it again. He used slightly different words this time, something about authorization and liability and the hospital's legal standing, but the substance was the same. Olivia Hart had been terminated. Her access had been revoked, and whatever was happening in this emergency room, she was not sanctioned to be part of it. The commander listened to all of it without moving. His name was Decker Mays, and he had the particular quality of stillness that men develop when they've spent enough time in situations where reacting too quickly gets people killed. He stood in the middle of the Stonebridge Medical Center emergency room in full tactical field configuration, 2 operators flanking him at a distance, and he listened to Warren Holt explain institutional hierarchy with an expression that gave away exactly nothing. When Holt finished, Mays looked at him for another moment. Then he turned back to Olivia. "What do you need?" he said. That was all. Holt made a sound. Not quite a word, something shorter and more reflexive than that. Dr. Greer, who had materialized at the edge of the floor during the last few minutes, put a hand on Holt's arm. It was the gesture of a man trying to prevent a worse mistake from compounding an existing one. Olivia had already turned back to the floor. Second trauma bay needs to be opened. We've got incoming from the Carver overpass and the east side collapse, and I need someone to pull every available blood type O negative from the bank right now, not in 5 minutes. She wasn't talking to Maze anymore. She was talking to the room, and the room moved. It wasn't a dramatic shift. It was more like a gear catching after slipping. Nurses who had been managing around the edges of the chaos found direction. The resident who'd challenged her 20 minutes ago was suddenly very focused on the task she'd just assigned him. A charge nurse, Olivia barely knew by name, appeared at her shoulder, asking the right question about the pediatric bay, and Olivia answered it without looking up from the chart she was reading. Marcus appeared from somewhere, gloveless but already pulling on a pair. "What do you need from me?" "Bay 3, the woman in cardiac. She's back, but she's not stable. Keep her talking if she's conscious, and if she codes again, you come get me before you restart compressions." "Why before?" "Because the attending will want to call it, and I need to see the rhythm first." She handed him a printout. "These are her last 3 strips." He took it, looked at her once more with that same expression from the stairwell, quiet and assessing, and went. Maze fell into step beside her as she moved toward the incoming trauma. "The second collapse site," he said, low enough that it was just for her. "Gas leak confirmed. Fires on scene, but they're pulling people out. We've got at least 9 critical inbound, possibly more. Burn injuries? Some, mostly crush and blast." She nodded. She was already thinking about the order of it, what Stonebridge could actually handle, what would need to be rerouted to Callaway Regional across the city, how to make that call before the ambulances were already here and the choice was gone. "You have a medic with your unit?" "2. I want them in here. We're going to be short." "Done." He touched his earpiece, made the call in 4 words. She didn't thank him. She kept moving, and he matched her pace, and neither of them acknowledged what was happening between them, which was a kind of compressed history operating in real time, the shorthand of people who had once worked under conditions where every second of explanation was a second something worse was happening. Warren Holt watched them from across the floor, and the expression on his face had moved from outrage through something more complicated to a kind of hollow shock that he hadn't yet had time to process fully. Greer stood beside him. Neither of them spoke. The first wave of Carver overpass casualties arrived at 17 minutes past the hour. 9 patients in 4 minutes, 3 critical, 2 of those immediately requiring surgical intervention. Olivia called the procedures before the ambulance doors were fully open, passing orders back through the bay before the gurneys had cleared the threshold. There was a moment. She would think about it later, though not for long, because she wasn't someone who lingered on moments. When she looked up from the first critical and saw the entire floor working in concert, everyone moving in the same direction, no one crossing anyone else's path, every handoff clean. It lasted about 4 seconds. Then someone called her name, and the next thing needed doing. The second wave came from the east side collapse. These were worse. Crush injuries had a particular profile that took experience to read correctly. The damage that wasn't visible, the cascade that started internally and didn't announce itself until it was almost too late. She moved through the bays in an order that looked random to anyone watching, but wasn't, hitting the quietly critical before the loudly urgent, because she'd learned in conditions no nursing program taught that the ones who weren't screaming were often the ones you were about to lose. Maze's 2 medics were good, combat-trained, focused, unimpressed by chaos. They slotted into the floor without friction and followed Olivia's lead without requiring the instruction to do so, which told her something about how Maze ran his unit. It was during the second wave that she had her first real disagreement of the night. Dr. Poe had reappeared. She didn't know where he'd been during the first hour. Somewhere in the building making a decision about whether or not to involve himself, she assumed. He came onto the floor with his attending authority reassembled around him and walked directly to a patient Olivia had triaged to immediate surgical. "This one needs imaging first," he said.
She looked up from what she was doing. He's got internal hemorrhage. Imaging wastes 8 minutes we don't have. You don't have the authority. He has no blood pressure and his abdomen is rigid. If you want to imaging him, that's your call, and you document it. She held Poe's gaze. But you document it.
Poe's face tightened. The resident beside him looked between them and then at the patient, and Olivia watched the resident make a calculation. The kind of calculation young doctors make when they're deciding whose read of a situation they actually trust. The resident said, "She's right about the presentation." Poe looked at the resident with an expression that promised a later reckoning. Then he looked at Olivia. Then he looked at the patient, who had the pale, sweating stillness of someone the body was running out of ways to compensate for. "Get the OR on the line," Poe said. To no one in particular. To the room. Olivia was already moving. 2 hours into the mass casualty response, Stonebridge Medical Center had received 31 patients, lost 2, both of whom had arrived without viable signs and had been called correctly at intake, and stabilized the rest to varying degrees. It was not a perfect outcome. It was the outcome that was possible given the conditions and the resources and the 40-minute gap at the beginning when the floor hadn't had clear direction. Olivia knew the math of it. She didn't dwell on the 2, but she knew their names. The floor began to level out around 9:45. Not quiet. An ER after a mass casualty never went quiet. It just shifted from acute surge to sustained management. But the frequency of the emergencies dropped below the threshold where everything felt like it was about to break at once. Staff who'd been running on adrenaline started to feel the edge of it. Someone in the break room was crying quietly, and someone else was probably in there not crying and holding it down in a different way. Olivia washed her hands at the sink in Bay 2 and stood there for a moment with the water running. Marcus appeared in the doorway. "You eat anything since this morning?" "No. There's something in the break room. I don't know what it is exactly." "Later," she said. He nodded. Didn't leave. "That guy. The military one. He hasn't taken his eyes off this floor for the last 2 hours." "I know. Who is he?" She turned off the water, dried her hands. "Someone from before?" Marcus was quiet for a beat. "Before what?" "Before this," she said, and walked out. Mayes was standing near the nursing station, where he'd been when the surge peaked and where he remained now that it had subsided. Not hovering, not interfering, just present in the way that people with operational authority are present when they're watching something unfold and making ongoing assessments. His 2 medics were assisting with patient transfers at the other end of the floor. He saw her coming and straightened. "We need to talk," he said. "I know." There was a small consultation room off the main corridor, glass-walled, visible from the floor, used for family notifications and difficult conversations. She went in. He followed. He didn't close the door, which she noted. "How much do you know about Clifton Brewer?" he said. She kept her expression level. 61-year-old male, admitted 6 weeks ago, COPD exacerbation as the admitting diagnosis. I have concerns about the accuracy of that diagnosis and about the integrity of his chart records. Mays looked at her for a long moment. "He's federal." She thought so. "Which agency?" "That's complicated." "Decker?" Something moved across his face at the use of his first name, not surprise, more like the acknowledgement of a register they were now speaking in. "He was embedded in a financial network we've been tracking for the better part of 3 years. Infrastructure fraud initially. It expanded. Into what? Healthcare, among other things." He paused. Brewer was building a case. He had documentation, physical records, not digital. They knew how to scrub digital, so he went old school. Paper trail, chain of custody, the whole structure. He was supposed to deliver it 8 weeks ago. What happened? He got sick. Mays said it plainly. Genuinely sick. Joe, we're not disputing the COPD, that's real. But the timing put him in a hospital before the handoff. And then things started going wrong with his treatment in ways that looked like medical mismanagement and may have been something else. Olivia was quiet. "The records he was carrying," Mays said. "We don't know where they are." "You think they're here?" We think he was smart enough to make sure they were somewhere safe before he lost the ability to make that call. She thought about Brewer's careful words, the measured vagueness, the way he'd looked at the ceiling when she asked about his work. He'd been here 6 weeks, she said. He had time to make arrangements. That's what we're operating on. Outside the glass wall of the consultation room, the floor continued its regulated motion. Nurses moving, monitors beeping, the orderly transit of a department that had been through something and was processing it. Warren Holt was visible at the far end, talking to someone she didn't recognize. Greer was beside him. Both of them kept glancing toward the consultation room. "The chart tampering," she said. "We saw your reports. That's partly why I'm here." "Partly. The other part is the incoming situation. But yes." He met her gaze. "When your nursing board report flagged through the system, it cross-indexed with an existing federal inquiry marker. That put your name on a list, and then when this," he gestured toward the floor, the residue of the evening, "activated, and Brewer's location was confirmed, it made sense to come here directly." "You came because of me or because of Brewer?" "Both," he said. "But Olivia," he waited until she looked at him fully. "If what we think is in those records is actually in those records, this hospital has a serious problem that goes well beyond chart tampering." She didn't ask what kind of problem. She already had a shape of it in her mind. The falsified values, the unsigned medication, the speed with which Holt and Greer had moved to silence her, the precision of it. People didn't move that fast and that cleanly to protect a doctor's ego or a department's liability exposure. They moved that fast to protect something they were afraid of having exposed. "I need to see Brewer," she said. "He's in the ICU." "I know where he is." Mays stepped aside. She went up. The ICU on the 3rd floor was quieter than the ER, the contained technological quiet of a unit where everything was monitored and the chaos was internal and invisible. Brewer was in room 7, visible through the glass panel from the hallway. He was awake. She could see that from the door. His eyes were open, tracking the ceiling with the deliberate attention of a man thinking hard about something in the only space left to him. The ICU charge nurse, a woman named Gail, who Olivia had interacted with twice and found professionally exact, stopped her at the unit entrance. "You're not credentialed for this floor," Gail said. She wasn't hostile. She was doing her job, the same way Olivia had always done hers. "I know. I need 5 minutes with the patient in room 7. His name is Clifton Brewer." "I can't authorize that." "Can you call down and check with Dr. Mays?" Gail looked at her. "Who is Dr. Mays?" "The federal officer currently coordinating with your hospital administration. He's on the ground floor." She paused. "He'll tell you the same thing I'm telling you." Gail looked at her for another moment, then picked up the phone. She made the call. She listened. Her expression shifted in the small way that expressions do when the information arriving doesn't match the framework you were operating under. She hung up. "5 minutes," she said. "I'll be at the station." "Thank you." Brewer heard her come in. He turned his head without the IV lines going taut. He'd learned how to move around them, which meant he'd been awake a lot. His eyes found her, and he said, without preamble, "I was wondering when they'd send someone." "Nobody sent me," she said. "I came on my own." He studied her. "They fired you." "Yes." "And you're still here." "Apparently." She pulled the chair close to the bed, not to create an intimate setting, but because she didn't want to be overheard. "Mr. Brewer, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to be direct back. That's the only way I know how. The people running this hospital have been altering your chart. I documented it, I reported it, and then I got fired for it. Tonight a federal officer arrived asking about you. So tell me, what's in this hospital that they're trying to protect?" Brewer looked at her for a long time. Outside the room, through the glass, the ICU proceeded in its careful, monitored way. "You know what I used to do?" he said finally. I know it wasn't logistics. Something that was almost a smile moved across his face. Financial forensics. 15 years, federal contracts. You follow the money long enough, you find out who's moving it and why, and sometimes what you find is things people would do a lot to keep buried. He paused, took a careful breath. His lungs were still fighting.
The network I was documenting. It runs through a dozen institutions. Medical facilities, insurance processors, billing clearinghouses. The fraud is in the gap between what gets billed and what gets delivered. Phantom procedures. Altered records. Patients who got less than what was documented, and nobody ever knew the difference. He looked at the ceiling again. Sometimes the patients died of what they didn't get. She sat with that. I built the case over 3 years, he said. Every piece of it physical, sourced, verified. I got sick before I could deliver it. Ended up here. He closed his eyes for a moment. I wasn't going to let it disappear. Where is it? She said. Someone I trust has part of it. The rest... He stopped. The door opened. It wasn't Gale. It was a man in hospital administration scrubs. She recognized him from the 4th floor, one of Greer's office staff, a man she'd seen twice in passing and filed away without consciously deciding to. He had a tablet in his hand and the specific kind of purposeful expression that people wear when they're doing something they've been told to do and are trying to look like they're doing something routine. He stopped when he saw Olivia. She stood up. Patient consult, she said, with the level voice of someone who belonged exactly where they were. I'll be done in a moment. He didn't move. He looked at Brewer, then at her. His hand shifted on the tablet and she caught the angle of it. He wasn't looking at records. The screen was showing a text thread, and he was reading something that had just come in. This unit is restricted, he said. I have clearance for this visit. From who? From the federal officer coordinating with your administration. You're welcome to check with Dr. Greer. She said Greer's name deliberately, watching the man's face. The reaction was small, but it was there. A tightening around the eyes, a half-second recalibration. I'll need you to leave, he said. I'm leaving in 2 minutes. She turned back to Brewer, blocking the man's line of sight to the patient. Brewer was looking at her with an expression that had sharpened considerably in the last 30 seconds. She leaned slightly closer. Is there anything I should know before I go? She said quietly, like she was asking about his pain level. Brewer's eyes moved to his left wrist, a brief flicker, then back to her. She straightened. Thank you, Mr. Brewer. I'll check on you in the morning. She turned and walked toward the door. The administration man stepped aside, barely, and she moved past him into the hallway, keeping her pace unhurried. She heard him follow her out, heard him take the opposite direction toward the nursing station. She waited until she was at the stairwell door. Then she thought about what Brewer's eyes had done. His left wrist. He'd looked at his left wrist. She stood in the stairwell and thought about every time she'd been in that room over the past 6 weeks. About his personal effects. The things admitted patients were allowed to keep, cataloged and stored, or kept bedside. His watch had been on his left wrist when he came in. She'd noticed it because it was old, mechanical, the kind with a manual wind stem, and it had looked out of place against his hospital bracelet. She hadn't seen the watch on his wrist tonight. She went back to the ICU entrance. Gale was at the station. His personal effects, Olivia said. The patient in room 7. What's held in storage? Gale frowned. I can't release patient property. I'm not asking you to release it. I'm asking if a watch was included in his intake inventory. Gale looked at her. The pause was the pause of someone deciding how far to extend professional courtesy to a person who had, in the last 2 hours, earned a complicated kind of credibility. She pulled up the screen, read for a moment. Mechanical watch, silver case, listed as patient personal item, currently in bedside storage drawer per patient request. It's in the room? In the locked drawer, standard procedure. Olivia looked through the glass panel at room 7. The administration man was no longer visible in the unit. Her phone, her personal cell, still in her scrubs pocket, still technically hers even if the badge was gone, buzzed. She looked at it. A text from a number she didn't recognize. They know you talked to him. Get out of the unit now. She looked up. The door to the stairwell at the far end of the ICU corridor opened. 2 men she'd never seen before came through it. Not hospital staff. Wrong posture, wrong gait, wearing the right clothes badly the way people do when the clothes are a cover for something else. They were moving toward her with the kind of purpose that didn't belong in an ICU hallway at this hour. And the one on the right had his hand near his jacket pocket in the specific, practiced way that she recognized on a level that bypassed thought entirely.
Every trained instinct she had went cold and sharp and absolutely clear. She turned to Gale. "Lock down this unit," she said, "right now. Do not let those two men pass the entrance. Call security, not the hospital's security. Call 911. "What? Right now, Gale? I'm not asking." She was already moving. She went through the door at the end of the corridor before they reached the unit entrance, moving fast but not running, because running in a hospital makes people look, and right now, she needed the opposite of that. The stairwell swallowed her, concrete and fluorescent light, and the distant sound of the building's mechanical systems. And she took the stairs up instead of down, because down was where they'd expect her to go, and she needed 30 seconds to think before she made another choice. Third floor to fourth. She pushed through the door at the landing and came out into the administrative wing, carpeted, quiet. The kind of hallway that smelled like recycled air and institutional decision-making. The offices were dark at this hour, except for one at the end, Greer's, where light showed under the door and two voices spoke in the tightly modulated register of people having a conversation they believed was private. She pressed her back against the wall beside the door. Greer. "They don't have anything." She talked to him for 5 minutes with a nurse monitoring the whole unit. Second voice, male, one she didn't immediately place. 5 minutes is enough. You know what he knows. "Brewer doesn't have the documentation on him. We swept the room 3 times. "Then we're handling it." "You're not handling it. You fired the one nurse who'd been asking the right questions, and now there are federal operators on your floor, and a 911 call just went into dispatch from your ICU. That's not handling anything, Nolan. That's a controlled situation becoming uncontrolled." A pause. The sound of something being set down on a desk. Greer. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to find out what she knows and how much of it she's already passed to the military officer. I want that done in the next hour." "She's not going to..." "I don't care what she's going to. I'm telling you what needs to happen." Silence. Then footsteps moving toward the door. Olivia was already 6 feet down the hallway, walking at a moderate pace, facing away, by the time the door opened. She heard it, heard the pause, as whoever came out registered the hallway, and she turned the corner without looking back and kept moving. She needed Mays, and she needed him to understand what she'd just heard without giving her time to second-guess how much of it she was certain of. She took the elevator down. Stairs felt exposed now, and came out near the main nursing station on 2. Marcus was there, at the counter, writing something. He looked up when she came around the corner, and his expression shifted in the way it did when he was reading her and not liking what he read. "I need your phone," she said. "What's wrong with yours?" "I don't know who's monitoring it." He held her gaze for a half second, then pulled his phone from his pocket and handed it over without asking anything else. She moved into the supply alcove beside the station and called the number Mays had given her before she went upstairs. A direct line, not routed through the hospital system. He picked up on the second ring. "It's Olivia. I'm using a borrowed phone. 2 men came through the ICU stairwell about 12 minutes ago. Not hospital staff, wrong presentation. One of them was carrying. Gale should have locked the unit and called 911 by now." "She did." His voice was already clipped, already operational. "My people intercepted them at the unit entrance. Local PD is en route." "There's more." She kept her voice low. "Greer's office, 4th floor. He had a meeting with someone I didn't recognize, male voice. They know Brewer has documentation, and they've been unable to locate it. They know you're in the building. They're trying to find out what I've passed to you." A pause on his end. Not hesitation, calculation. "How certain are you about what you heard?" "Certain enough to tell you." "Okay." Another beat. "Stay off the 4th floor. Find somewhere with people around you and don't move until I come to you." "Decker." She stopped him before he could disconnect. "The watch. Brewer's watch. It's in his bedside drawer. He directed my attention to it." Silence. "Get to it before they do," she said. The line clicked. She stood in the supply alcove for a moment. The hospital moved around her. The soft machinery of a building that never fully slept. The particular nighttime frequency of corridor sounds and distant monitors and footsteps on linoleum. She thought about the 2 men in the ICU hallway. She thought about Greer's voice through the door, The way it had sounded less like a man managing a crisis and more like a man receiving instructions, which was a different thing entirely, and told her something about where the actual authority in this situation lived. She handed Marcus his phone when she came out. "Are you in trouble?" he said. "The hospital is in trouble," she said. "Whether that extends to us specifically depends on the next hour." "That's not comforting." "No." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you need?" She thought about it. "Stay on this floor. If anyone from administration comes down here asking about me or about Brewer, you didn't see me and you don't know anything about the watch. Can you do that?" "I don't know anything about a watch," he said, "because you haven't told me anything about a watch." "That's exactly right." She went back to the ER. The floor had settled into its post-surge state. Still busy, still full, but the frequency had dropped from overwhelming to manageable. The two military medics were still assisting, now running alongside the regular staff with the practiced ease of people who adapt fast. One of them, a young woman, compact and precise, who'd barely spoken all evening but had done everything correctly, caught Olivia's eye as she came through the doors. "Your heart?" the medic said. "Yes." "Commander said to tell you he's on 3. She paused. "And to not go to 3 yet." Olivia read the implication. He's handling something. He's handling 2 somethings. The third thing is the paperwork coming in from the federal liaison, which he said is going to make tonight look simple. She turned back to her patient without ceremony. His words. Olivia found an empty section of counter at the nursing station and stood there. She needed to be still for a moment. Her feet hurt. She'd been on them for 11 hours. First a full shift and then the surge and then everything after. And the fatigue was working its way into the back of her eyes in a way that she could manage for a while longer, but not indefinitely. She thought about what Mays had told her. A financial network running through healthcare infrastructure. Phantom procedures. Altered records. Patients who'd received less than what was documented. She thought about Brewer's exact words. Sometimes the patients died of what they didn't get. She thought about the sealed medication bag. She pulled a fresh incident report form from the station's supply drawer, paper, not electronic, and started writing. Not a formal report, just a timeline. Every conversation, every chart discrepancy, everything she'd documented, and every response she'd received. The date Brewer had been admitted, the date she'd first flagged the lab values, the date the entry had been altered, the 2 meetings with Poe and Greer, her termination. All of it, in the clearest language she had, referenced against the timestamps she remembered because she always remembered timestamps. She was halfway through the 3rd page when the ER doors opened and Mays came through them. He was moving differently than he had been. Not faster. Mays didn't move fast in a way that looked rushed. He moved fast in a way that looked like everything else was slow. But something about him had recalibrated. He came to her directly, which told her he'd been watching the floor before she saw him. "The watch," she said. "We have it." He glanced at the papers she was writing on. "What are those?" "A timeline. Everything I documented and witnessed in order." She kept writing. "If what you're dealing with is as large as Brewer described, you're going to need witness statements. Mine is going to be detailed and clean." He looked at her for a moment. "You're writing your own affidavit." "I'm writing a clear account of what I observed. What you do with it is your business." She finished the sentence she was on. "What was in the watch?" He didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer of a kind. A micro-storage unit embedded in the casing, the kind that's meant to look like a mechanical component. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. He paused. "The files on it are encrypted. We're working on that now." "But it exists." "It exists." She nodded and kept writing. Mays pulled up a stool and sat, which surprised her slightly. She'd expected him to stay standing, to stay operational, but he sat, and he was quiet for a moment, watching her write. And then he said, "You know, this is going to get complicated." "It's already complicated." "More complicated. When this opens up, and it's going to open fast once we crack that encryption, there are going to be inquiries, depositions, hearings. You're going to be a central witness." "I know. And they're going to try to undermine your credibility. Your employment history, the gaps in your record, the reasons you left your previous position. Let them. She turned a page. I know what I did and what I didn't do, and it's all in a file that people with the right clearance can access. If that's the game they want to play, it won't go the way they're hoping. He was quiet for another moment. Then, in a different register, quieter, less operational. It's been a long time. 3 years, she said. You dropped out completely. I needed to. She didn't elaborate. He didn't push. That was one of the things she'd always been able to rely on about Decker Mays. He understood the shape of things that didn't need to be spoken. You're good at this, he said. The floor tonight. You know that. I know what I'm trained for. That's not what I said. She looked up from the paper. He was watching her with an expression that wasn't soft. Mays didn't really do soft, but had something in it that was close to what other people meant by that word. Don't, she said, not unkindly. He nodded once. Stood. Back to operational. The 2 men from the ICU are in custody, he said. Local PD. They're not talking, which tells us who they're working for better than talking would. We've got federal attorneys on the phone with the DA's office now. This is going to move tonight. And Greer? And Holt? And whoever was in that office with Greer, we're pulling building access logs to identify him. He looked at the doors. They're still in the building, which is either arrogance or desperation, and I'm not sure which is worse for us. It's desperation, she said. Arrogant people leave when the situation shifts. Desperate people stay because they think there's still something to salvage. He considered that. The documentation Brewer built, if the encryption is cracked and the files are what we think they are, we're not talking about one hospital. We're talking about a network. Multiple facilities, multiple states, coordinated billing fraud over at least a decade. He paused. The number of affected patients is going to be significant. How significant? He met her eyes. We don't know yet. That's part of what we're going to find out. She looked back at her papers, wrote 2 more lines. Then she said, without looking up, the 2 people we lost tonight, in the surge. I saw the report. I want to know if their outcomes would have been different, under different circumstances, if the floor had been properly staffed and directed from the beginning. Olivia, I'm not looking for reassurance. I'm asking a clinical question. He was quiet for a moment. That's going to be part of the inquiry regardless. I know. I want to know the answer for myself, separate from the inquiry. He didn't tell her not to. He understood that she was going to carry those 2 names regardless of what any review board concluded, because that was the particular burden of people who were trained to save lives and who lived inside the math of the ones they couldn't. He understood it because he carried his own version of the same weight, and there was no resolution for it, only the continued work of doing the next thing correctly. I'll send you the incident summary when we have it, he said. She nodded. He left. She finished the timeline. 4 pages, dense and precise, every material fact she could reconstruct from memory. She dated each entry, noted the presence or absence of witnesses, flagged the points where she had documentary evidence versus recall. When she was done, she read through it once, made 3 small corrections, and folded the pages into her scrubs pocket. Then she went to find Warren Holt. He wasn't hard to locate. He was in the administrative conference room on the main floor, a room with a long table and glass walls visible from the corridor, which meant he either hadn't thought about being visible or was past caring about it. He was sitting at the head of the table with his phone in both hands and a look on his face that she associated with men who were revising their understanding of how badly things had gone. Dr. Greer was not with him. That was interesting. She opened the conference room door and walked in. Holt looked up. His expression cycled through several things quickly. Surprise, anger, and then something underneath both of those that she recognized as fear, doing its best impression of authority. You have no business being in this room, he said. I have a few things I'd like to say while I have the chance. She sat down, not because she was being defiant, but because she'd been on her feet for 11 hours, and she was tired, and sitting felt like a reasonable choice. I want you to know that I understand what happened here, and I want you to understand that I understand it, because I think it matters that you know before the next few hours make it impossible to have this conversation. He stared at her. What are you talking about? Brewer's records, The encrypted storage, the alterations to the chart, the medication that wasn't given, and the meeting in Greer's office tonight where someone told him to find out how much I'd passed to the military officer. She kept her voice level, factual, the same voice she used for clinical reports. I'm not telling you this to threaten you. I'm telling you because you should know how much of what happened here tonight is already documented and in federal hands. His face had gone through something complicated and arrived somewhere pale. I also want to tell you, she continued, that 2 patients died tonight during the surge. You can look at the record and tell yourself they arrived without viable signs, and you'd be technically correct. But what I know, and what I'll be asked in a deposition at some point, is what the floor would have looked like with full, competent staffing from the beginning. That's a question with an answer, and the answer is not going to look good in the context of why this department has been losing experienced staff for the past 2 years. You can't, he stopped, started again. You were fired for cause. I was fired because I documented what I found, which is going to be a very instructive sequence of events when it's laid out in front of a federal review board. She stood. I'm going to go check on my patients. I'm still calling them that because they are. She moved toward the door. Mr. Holt, whatever you're about to do in the next hour, whatever call you're thinking of making, whatever version of events you're working on, I'd encourage you to think carefully about the difference between what can be explained and what can't. She left him in the conference room with his phone in his hands. The ER received 2 more ambulances between 10:40 and 11:15, a fire from a residential building on the south side, 3 people with smoke inhalation, and 1 with second-degree burns covering 30% of his body. Olivia worked the burn patient with a surgical resident and one of the military medics, doing what could be done at this facility level while coordinating a transfer to the burn unit at Callaway Regional. It was meticulous, uncomfortable work. Burn care always was, and the patient was in enough pain that managing it pharmacologically while keeping him stable for transport required exact attention. She gave it that attention. She didn't think about Holt or Greer or the conference room or the papers in her pocket. She thought about this man, his name, which was Porter, age 44, who had gone back into his building for his dog and gotten the dog out and then gotten trapped in the stairwell on the way down. The dog had survived. She didn't know why she found that relevant, but she did. Porter was stable for transport at 11:40. She watched the ambulance leave through the bay doors and stood there for a moment in the cold air with the smell of exhaust and night on her face, and she allowed herself 10 seconds of not managing anything. Then she went back inside. Mays found her at 11:53. She could tell from the way he was moving that something had broken open. Not collapsed, broken open, the way an investigation does when the first major piece of evidence cracks and everything compressed behind it starts moving at once. The encryption, she said. 2 hours of work and we're through. He kept his voice low, but there was something in it she hadn't heard all evening, a coiled intensity. Not excitement exactly, but its colder, more professional cousin. The files are extensive. We're talking organized documentation, financial records, billing data, internal communications going back 9 years, names, dates, specific procedures that were billed and not performed, specific patients. He paused. And specific payments to specific individuals at specific facilities. How many facilities? 14 so far. Our analysts are still reading. He looked at her directly. Stonebridge is in there. So is the billing processor they use. So are 2 names that you would recognize if I said them, which I'm not going to do in this hallway. She understood. Greer. He didn't confirm or deny it. He didn't need to. Federal warrants are being drafted as we speak, coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office in this district. We're looking at simultaneous action. You don't give people in a network like this time to communicate once you move. When? Soon. Tonight, if the warrants clear fast enough. He looked at the floor, then back at her. I need you to understand what's about to happen to this building. When federal agents come through that door, it's going to be disruptive to patient care in ways that... I can manage the floor, she said. You're not employed here. I've been managing this floor for the last 4 hours as a fired employee. I don't think the jurisdiction question is your biggest problem right now. Something moved across his face, that not quite a smile. No, he said. It's not. She looked at him. What is? Greer left the building 20 minutes ago. He said it flatly. Building security logged him out. We weren't watching exits, we were watching floors. That's on us. He paused. He had a bag with him. She thought about what that meant. A man who'd been in that building managing the situation all evening, who'd stayed when staying felt controllable, who had left the moment something told him it wasn't. He knew the encryption was cracked. That's what we think. Someone inside the operation, we don't know who yet, tipped him. So he's running. He has a 20-minute head start and access to resources we don't fully know the scope of. Maze's jaw was set. We have people moving, but Stonebridge isn't a small city, and if he's going for a specific exit route, what about Holt? Still in the building. He hasn't made any calls in the last 40 minutes. We have a tap on the administrative lines. He's not calling anyone, she said, because he's sitting in that conference room trying to decide if there's a version of this he survives. Is there? She thought about it honestly. That depends on how deep his involvement goes versus Greer's. If he's downstream, if the decisions were being made above him and he was just enabling them, there's a cooperation argument to be made. She paused. But if he's been directing this from inside, then no, not really. Maze nodded. He pressed the earpiece in his left ear, listened to something, and his expression shifted, a small tightening around the eyes. The warrant's cleared, he said. She straightened. Federal agents are 6 minutes out. He looked at the ER around them. The floor she'd held together through a mass casualty event. The staff still working. The patients still monitored. The building still functioning under the weight of everything that was about to change about it. I need you to stay visible and stay on this floor. When they come in, you're going to need to make sure the clinical side doesn't lose continuity. I will. He turned toward the door, then stopped, turned back. Olivia. He said her name the way people say names when they're about to say something they've been holding. What I said earlier about you being good at this, I meant both things, the floor and the other thing. You know that. She looked at him for a moment. Go find Greer, she said. He went. She turned back to the ER. 4 patients she was actively watching. 2 in recovery, 1 in transit. The staff around her, tired, running on the back end of a surge, beginning to process what a night this had been, moving through their tasks with the focus that comes from not having the time to feel it yet. She went to Bay 3 to check on the cardiac patient, the woman who'd coded twice and come back and who Marcus had been managing. The woman was awake now, oxygen cannula in, watching the ceiling with the particular focus of someone who knew how close it had been. Her name was Terry. She was 57 and she'd been on her way back from visiting her sister when the overpass accident happened. How are you feeling? Olivia asked. Terry looked at her. Like I died twice. You did, and came back twice. Is that good? By most standards. Terry was quiet for a moment. You were here earlier, weren't you? When there were a lot of people. Yes. You were the one calling everything. Olivia checked the drip rate. I was helping. You were the one calling everything, Terry said again, not as a question. I could hear you from in here. I couldn't see, but I could hear. You sounded like... She paused, looking for the word. Like you knew. Not like you thought you knew. Like you'd been somewhere that taught you what to do when everything was bad. Olivia wrote the drip check in the log. Try to sleep. What's your name? Hart. Olivia Hart? She looked up. Terry's eyes had something in them that wasn't just recovery-fogged gratitude. There was a directness in it, something focused. I used to work for the district attorney's office, Terry said. 12 years before I retired. I know what federal warrant execution looks like from the outside. I heard those agents on the radio in the ambulance, their protocol language. She paused. What's happening in this building tonight? Olivia stood straight, and then the sound arrived. Multiple vehicles, the distinctive compression of doors opening in rapid sequence, the particular organized movement of people entering a building with authority and purpose. Federal agents. Coming through the front entrance. Olivia and Terry both looked toward the ER doors through the glass panels, at the movement in the main lobby. Uniformed agents splitting into 2 teams, moving with practiced speed. Then the overhead PA crackled. And the voice that came through it was not the hospital's automated system. It was not a code call. It was a voice she recognized, one of Maze's operators, using the hospital PA to issue a building-wide directive that told everyone inside these walls, all at once, that what was happening was not a drill and not a mistake. And beneath the sound of the PA, from somewhere in the upper floors, a fire alarm started screaming, not triggered by smoke, triggered deliberately. Olivia was already moving toward the stairwell door before the second alarm joined the first. The fire alarm was still screaming when Olivia hit the stairwell door and took the stairs two at a time toward the second-floor landing. Not because she thought there was a fire, the alarm had the wrong character for that. Too clean, too immediate. The kind of activation that happens when someone pulls a manual station rather than when heat or smoke triggers a sensor. Someone in this building had just bought themselves a reason to move people. She stopped on the second-floor landing and thought about that for 3 seconds. A manual pull station. On an upper floor, most likely. The sound had the slight delay of distance when it came through the PA. Someone who needed the building in motion. Someone who needed staff looking at evacuation routes instead of at them. Greer had a 20-minute head start and was already gone. Holt was in the conference room, which meant whoever pulled that alarm was a third variable she hadn't fully accounted for. The voice from Greer's office, the male she hadn't recognized, the one who'd been giving instructions rather than receiving them. She went back down to the ER. The federal agents were already through the lobby and moving with the organized speed of people executing a plan they'd drilled. 2 teams, she counted. One heading toward administration, one toward the ICU. A third, smaller group was at the main nursing station talking to the charge nurse on duty, and from the body language it was a conversation, not a detainment, which meant they were gathering information rather than making arrests yet. One of Maze's operators, the compact female medic from earlier, whose name Olivia still didn't know, appeared at her elbow. "Commander wants you to stay on this floor and keep clinical operations running," she said. "The alarm is a false pull. Fire department confirmed no heat signature. They're standing by but not entering. Who pulled it?" "We're working on that." She paused. "Building camera system went down 6 minutes ago. Someone cut the feed from inside." Olivia looked at her. From inside meaning someone with access to the security infrastructure. That's the working assumption. Which meant someone had been in this building with specific technical knowledge of its systems, and that person was not Holt. Holt was a hospital director, not an operator, and was not Greer, who'd been gone before the alarm. This was the third variable, and they'd missed him because they'd been looking at the people they already knew about. "Tell Maze the cameras were cut from inside," she said, "and tell him the person who did it may still be in the building." The medic was already on her radio. Olivia turned back to the ER because the ER still had patients in it and a false fire alarm did not change that. And the fundamental thing about working in emergency medicine was that you didn't stop managing the room because the room had gotten complicated. She did a fast circuit, checked the monitors in every occupied bay, confirmed the transfer protocols for the 2 patients waiting on ambulances to Callaway Regional, made sure the 2 military medics who were still on the floor knew to hold their positions. The staff around her were managing the alarm with the practiced response of people who'd drilled evacuations but could read the difference between an operational alarm and a disruptive one. Nobody was panicking. A few people were frustrated. That was fine. Dr. Poe was standing near the ambulance bay doors with his arms crossed, watching the federal agents move through the lobby with an expression that had journeyed a long distance from his usual attending authority and arrived somewhere smaller and less certain. Olivia stopped beside him. "The patients in bays 1 through 6 need active monitoring for the next 2 hours," she said. "The woman in bay 3, Terry, watch her rhythm. She's been stable, but she coded twice, and I want someone on her every 20 minutes. Poe looked at her. He'd been looking at her differently since about the second hour of the surge, the shift that happens when people stop seeing the role and start seeing the competence behind it. It wasn't warm. Poe was not a warm man, but it was a different category of attention than dismissal. "You're giving me assignments," he said. "I'm telling you what I'd want done if I weren't about to be pulled in another direction." She paused. "You can make your own calls, but that's what I'd want." He was quiet for a moment. "The altered chart," he said. "The medication log." "Yes." I didn't know about the chart alteration. He said it without looking at her, which meant it cost him something. I knew the medication timing was irregular. I should have looked harder at that. It wasn't an apology. She hadn't expected one and didn't need one. Poe. She waited until he looked at her. Bay 3, 20-minute checks. He nodded, once, and went. The federal agent running the administrative team was a woman named Castillo. Olivia caught her name from the brief exchange at the nursing station. Castillo was in her 40s, methodical, with the particular efficiency of someone who'd done this kind of work long enough that the size of the operation didn't change the process. She came to Olivia at 11 minutes past midnight with a recording device in her hand and a form on a tablet. "You're Olivia Hart," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "We have your timeline document. Commander Mayes gave us a copy. I need to ask you some follow-up questions when you have a window." "I have a window now if you make it 10 minutes. Castillo made it 9. She asked clean, specific questions and wrote down the answers without editorializing, which Olivia appreciated. She wanted to know the exact sequence of the chart discrepancy discovery, the precise content of the Greer meeting, and the specific moment and words when Holt had terminated her employment. Olivia gave her all of it, exact and sequential, and Castillo noted it without expression. "One more," Castillo said. "The man in Greer's office tonight. You heard his voice but didn't see him." "Correct." "Could you identify the voice if you heard it again?" Olivia thought about it. The voice had been in the mid-baritone register, measured, with a slight flatness to certain vowels that suggested either regional origin or controlled affect. "Probably," she said. Castillo nodded and put the tablet away. "We're going to need you available for a formal deposition within the next 48 hours. Can you provide contact information?" Olivia gave her Marcus's number, since she still wasn't certain about her own phone. Castillo left. 3 minutes later, Mays came through the ER doors. She could see from across the floor that something had resolved or broken, one or the other, and from the set of his posture, she thought it was the latter. "Holt," he said when he reached her. "He's cooperating." She hadn't expected that quite this fast. "He lawyered up first?" "No lawyer. He asked to speak to federal investigators directly. He's been in the conference room for the last 40 minutes producing documentation." Mays paused. "He says Greer was the operational contact, the one managing the hospital's participation in the network. Holt claims he knew about the billing irregularities and signed off on certain records, but that Greer managed the relationship with the network's coordinators directly. He's trying to position himself as downstream, aggressively. Is it working? Depends on what the files from the watch say about who signed what and when. Our analysts are cross-referencing now." He looked at her. "The third person, the one in Greer's office. You found him?" "We found who he is. The access logs for the security infrastructure, the system that was cut, they require a specialized administrative credential. Only 4 people in this hospital have that credential. One of them is a facilities manager named Radwick, who's been with the hospital for 19 years. "And?" "Radwick is on vacation in another state. His credentials were used tonight." She understood immediately. Someone cloned his access. Or had it cloned, which means the person who cut those cameras had either technical resources or institutional contacts that go well beyond a hospital administrator. He paused. "We think the voice you heard wasn't a hospital employee at all. We think he's a network-level operator. Someone who moves between the facilities, manages problems, keeps things clean. A fixer," she thought, the kind of person a network running across 14 facilities would need. Someone who could appear in an administrative office, issue instructions, and disappear through a stairwell without leaving a name on any paperwork. "He's still in the building," she said. "We think so. He'd have had to move through the lobby to exit, and the agents were through the front door before the cameras went down. We have people at every exit." "Then he's waiting." "For what?" She thought about it. A man who was good at making things disappear, trapped in a building that was now full of federal agents. What would he be waiting for? Not rescue. That was too slow and too uncertain. Not to be found. He'd cut the cameras specifically to avoid that. He was waiting for an opportunity. A gap. Something that would create movement and confusion that he could move inside. "The patient transfer," she said suddenly. The two patients waiting for ambulances to Callaway Regional. When those ambulances arrive, there will be movement. Gurneys, staff, vehicles, loading bay doors opening. Mays was already on his radio before she finished the sentence. She followed him to the ambulance bay. The loading area outside the ER had two bays, deep concrete alcoves with roll-up doors, large enough for full ambulance access, with a small staging area between them. It was not well lit at this hour. The exterior lighting had a gap on the south side where one of the overhead fixtures had been out for 3 weeks. She'd logged a maintenance request for it herself 10 days ago, with no response. The ambulances weren't there yet. They were 4 minutes out, according to the radio traffic she could hear on the medic's channel. Mays positioned 2 agents at the staging area without making it visible that he was positioning them. One near the equipment shed to the left, one at the angle of the south alcove where the lighting failed. Then he came back to her. "You should go inside." "I want to see this." "Olivia, I've been in this building for 15 hours. I want to see it." He looked at her for a moment, making a calculation. Then he moved her to a position near the interior door, not exposed, not in anyone's path, but with a clear sight line to the staging area. The ambulances arrived at 12:41. The first one backed in cleanly. Doors opened. The handoff team came out from the ER. 2 nurses and a tech focused on the transfer, moving the gurney with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done 1,000 of these. Normal. Controlled. The loading bay door on the north side rolled up fully, and the bay flooded with the amber-white wash of the ambulance interior lighting. The south bay stayed dark. For 40 seconds, nothing happened. Just the transfer, the voices of the nurses coordinating, the specific sounds of a patient being moved safely from one care setting to another. Then Olivia saw the movement. Not dramatic, not running, just a shape in the south alcove using the cover of the ambulance's lighting to cross a space that had been shadow a moment before, moving toward the gap between the 2 vehicles, where the ambulance's blind side and the broken overhead fixture created a pocket of darkness large enough for a person to move through. He was good. She'd give him that. If she hadn't been standing exactly where she was, at the exact angle she was, she wouldn't have caught it. She said Mays' name once, quietly. He'd already seen it. The 2 agents moved before she finished saying his name. Not fast, not aggressive. The kind of measured, certain movement that communicates to the person being approached that the calculation has already been run and there's no version of the next 10 seconds that works out in their favor. The man in the south alcove froze for exactly 1 second. She saw it. The freeze, the assessment, and then the very fast decision that the assessment was correct and there was nowhere to go. He raised his hands. One of the agents said something she couldn't hear. The man in the alcove responded. Then the second agent moved in, and it was over in the quiet, procedural way that these things were over when they were handled correctly. She let out a slow breath. Mays stood beside her as they walked the man in from the loading bay. Mid-50s, unremarkable in every visible way, the kind of face that was designed to not stay in memory. He was calm, the calm of someone who'd been in difficult situations before and knew that panic was a liability. He looked at the agents. He looked at the staging area. He looked, once, at Mays. He did not look at Olivia, which told her he knew exactly who she was. Inside, the second transfer was completing. The nurses were coming back through the ER doors. The loading bay doors rolled down, and Stonebridge Medical Center, in the fluorescent normality of its late-night operations, continued to function around the architecture of everything that had just happened within it. The interrogation of the network operator, whose name, it emerged over the following 3 hours, was Darren Solt, produced the kind of compressed, consequential information that investigators spend years trying to get to. Solt did not cooperate out of remorse or conscience. He cooperated because he understood, with the flat pragmatism of someone who'd spent 2 decades managing risk for people who would not manage risk for him, that the documentation Brewer had built was comprehensive enough that his position inside the network's hierarchy was already fully visible. Cooperation was the only tool he had left, and he used it with the same efficient professionalism he'd applied to everything else. By 3 a.m, the scope of what the files contained had become legible to the federal team. Castillo came to find Olivia in the break room, where she'd finally, at Mays' insistence, sat down and eaten half of something that had been left on the table. and gave her a summary that was careful in its language but unambiguous in its implications. 14 healthcare facilities across 3 states, including Stonebridge. Systematic billing fraud spanning 9 years. Phantom procedures totaling, on current estimate, over $40 million across the network. Altered records in at least 600 patient files. 31 documented cases where treatment deviations, medications not given, procedures not performed, monitoring not done, had resulted in adverse patient outcomes. 11 of those patients had died. Not all of those deaths could be directly attributed to the treatment deviations, but enough of them could that the criminal exposure was, in Castillo's careful language, significant. Olivia sat with that number for a moment. 11. The Stonebridge cases, she said, specifically. 4 adverse outcomes with documented treatment deviation. 2 deaths among those 4. Castillo paused. We're going to need forensic medical review of each case. That process will take time. 2 deaths. In her building. On record she'd been trying to correct. She didn't say anything. She looked at the table, at the half-eaten thing on the plate, and she thought about Brewer's words. Sometimes the patients died of what they didn't get. And she thought about how long she'd been in this building, and how much of what had happened tonight had started with a sealed medication bag and a number that didn't match. There's one more thing, Castillo said. She set a physical photograph on the table, printed, from what looked like a security system with better resolution than Stonebridge's, a different building's cameras, somewhere with more current equipment. We cross-referenced Solt's access credentials against a travel log we pulled from the network's internal communication system. He was in Stonebridge 3 weeks ago. Olivia looked at the photograph. It showed a hospital corridor, 2 figures. One was Solt, identifiable despite the angle. The other was in partial profile, gray-haired, tall, a face she almost recognized but not quite. That's not Greer, she said. No. She looked up. That's a senior member of the State Medical Board, Castillo said, the one responsible for licensing and disciplinary oversight of facilities in this region. Olivia understood what that meant, slowly and completely. The network hadn't just been operating inside the facilities. It had been operating inside the oversight structure that was supposed to catch exactly what it was doing. Every complaint, every report, every flag that should have triggered an external review had been going to an office that was part of the problem. That's why the board complaints went nowhere, she said. That's our working theory. She looked at the photograph again. How many people? On the board? We don't know yet. The investigation is expanding. Castillo picked up the photograph. We're going to need your documentation of every formal complaint you filed, including the nursing board report and the dates and reference numbers associated with each one. I have all of it. I know. We'll be in touch. Castillo stood. For what it's worth, Nurse Hart, the report you filed is what triggered the cross-index that put your name on the federal system. If you hadn't filed it, we'd still be looking at Brewer's transfer and working backward. She paused. You started this. She left. Olivia sat in the break room alone for a few minutes. The building around her had taken on the particular quality of a place that has been permanently altered, not visibly, not yet, but in the way that all the subsequent activity would be oriented in relation to what had happened tonight, the way a landscape reorients around something that's changed its fundamental geography. Greer was found at 4:17 in the morning, not by Mays's people, by local law enforcement, at a budget motel off the Western Bypass, 9 miles from the hospital. He'd made it further than Mays had thought he'd get, which spoke to preparation. He'd had a go-bag, cash, a vehicle he'd pre-positioned. What he hadn't accounted for was a toll camera on the westbound approach to the bypass, timed and recorded, that put his vehicle on a specific road at a specific time, and a patrol officer who'd received the bolo and knew that road well enough to make a quick assessment about the limited number of places someone would stop on it at 4 in the morning. Mays relayed the information to Olivia with the brevity of someone delivering a status update. They have him. He's being transported. Is he talking? Not yet. His lawyer arrived fast, which tells you something about how prepared he was for this possibility. She thought about Greer in his office on the 4th floor, managing her out of her employment with the smooth efficiency of a man who'd done it before. She thought about the specific quality of his manner, not cruel, Not even particularly aggressive, just utterly certain that the institutional machinery moved in the direction he pointed it. The certainty of a man who'd been protected for a long time. "The board member," she said, "in the photograph. Federal warrants issued 40 minutes ago. We're coordinating with the state attorney general's office." He paused. "This is going to be a long process, Olivia. Months, possibly years, for the full scope of it." "I know. You're going to be in the middle of it." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the break room, the ER was entering its pre-dawn frequency. Quieter, the night having processed its emergencies. The building settling toward the shift change that would bring fresh staff and the slow recalibration of a morning. Through the break room window, she could see a slice of parking lot, and in it, 3 federal vehicles still positioned alongside the hospital's ordinary infrastructure. "Holt," she said, "still cooperating. His attorney arrived an hour ago, and they've been in there since." Mays paused. "He's giving them the financial records. The hospital's internal copies, separate from anything the network was managing. Apparently he kept parallel documentation. Whether that was self-protection or something else, I don't know. What happens to the hospital? It stays open. Patients don't stop needing care because the administration is under federal investigation. There'll be interim management placed while the inquiry runs, probably a federal monitor for the duration." He paused. "The staff? Most of them had no idea. Poe didn't know the full scope of it based on what we can see." She thought about Poe, about Bay 3, 20-minute checks, about the expression on his face when he'd said, "I should have looked harder at that." "Poe knew enough," she said. "Not everything, but enough. That'll be for the review board to assess." She nodded. The shift change happened at 6. New nurses came in, fresh and carrying coffee, processing the sight of federal vehicles in the lot, and the federal presence still visible in the building with the varied reactions of people absorbing a situation they'd heard about secondhand during a drive-in. Some of them found Olivia and asked direct questions, which she answered as directly as she could without speculating about what she didn't know. Some of them just looked at her with an expression she didn't immediately categorize. Marcus found her at 6:40, near the end of what had been a 15-hour stretch on her feet. "You need to sleep," he said. "I know." "Is it done?" She thought about Greer in custody, Holt cooperating, Solt in federal detention, the board member whose name she'd seen on a warrant, the 14 facilities, the $40 million, the 11 patients, the encrypted files on a watch in a bedside drawer that an old man with damaged lungs had protected with meticulous, quiet, determined care. "It's not done," she said, "but it started." Marcus nodded. He'd known her long enough now to understand the difference and to understand that the difference mattered to her. "There's a reporter outside," he said. 2 of them. They have cameras. Already. Word travels." He paused. "Castillo spoke to them. She's managing what they can report about the investigation. What about the hospital side of it?" "Nobody's authorized to speak." He tilted his head slightly. "Which means they're going to want to talk to the nurse who ran the ER floor during a mass casualty event and then got swept up in a federal investigation on the same night. I'm not talking to reporters." "I didn't think you were." He looked at her steadily. "But they know your name, Olivia. However that happened, they know it." She sat with that. The reporters were the beginning of the visible part, she understood. The part that moved in the open, through news cycles and public record and the slow machinery of institutional consequence. Up until now, this had been operational, contained in the building, managed by people with federal authority and specific training. Once it was visible, it became something else. Something harder to control and harder to shelter, which was both the problem and the point. She was about to say something to Marcus when Castillo appeared in the break room doorway. "Nurse Hart." Her expression had the quality of someone delivering information that has weight to it. "The patient in room 7, Clifton Brewer." Olivia straightened. "He's awake, and he's asking for you specifically." Castillo paused. "And he says he has something he didn't tell you about last night. Something he says changes the scope of what we found on the storage unit." The break room was quiet. "He says the files on the watch are the public record," Castillo said. "The version built for presentation, the kind of documentation that holds up in court." She met Olivia's eyes. He says the source material, the raw data, the original unedited communications, the full financial trail, is somewhere else entirely, and he'll only tell one person where it is. The name didn't need to be said. Olivia was already standing. Brewer looked smaller in the morning light. That was the first thing she noticed when she walked into room 7. The way the daylight coming through the blinds found the angles of a man who'd spent months fighting his own body and winning badly. He was sitting up, which was more than he'd managed most of the nights she'd checked on him, and the ventilator was gone, replaced by a nasal cannula running at 2 liters. His oxygen saturation read 94 on the monitor. Not good, but survivable. He'd been surviving on not good for a long time. He watched her cross the room and pull the chair close without being told. "You look terrible," he said. "I've been awake for 18 hours. I've been awake for 3 years. He adjusted the cannula, a gesture so habitual it was barely conscious. "Castillo told you I have more." "She told me you'd tell me where it is." He looked at her for a moment with the assessing quality she'd noticed in him from the first week. The particular attention of someone who had learned to read people as a professional skill and never fully stopped. "Why you?" he said. "You want to know why I'll only tell you." It crossed my mind. "Because you're the only person in this building who saw the medication bag," he said, "and logged it, and then got fired for logging it." He paused. "Everyone else in this situation is doing their job. Mays, Castillo, the federal team. They're excellent at what they do, and they're doing it for the right reasons. But they're doing it because it's the mission. You did what you did before there was a mission, before there was any indication that anything larger was happening. You did it because a number didn't match, and a bag was still sealed, and you couldn't make yourself walk past it." She said nothing. "That's the rarest thing," he said. "Most people can talk themselves into walking past it. They have reasons. Good ones, most of the time. Self-preservation, institutional pressure, the practical reality that one nurse filing one report against a senior physician is unlikely to change anything." He looked at the window. "You didn't walk past it." "Where is it, Mr. Brewer?" He almost smiled. "Direct. I always appreciated that about you." He reached for the water glass on his bedside table, drank slowly, set it down. "The source material is in a storage unit. Commercial facility, south side of Stonebridge, rented under a name that is not my name. The key is with my attorney in a sealed envelope with instructions that the envelope is to be opened only upon my authorization or my death." He paused. "I'm authorizing." He gave her the attorney's name and office address, which she wrote on the back of a patient education pamphlet she found in the drawer because it was the only paper available. "The facility unit number," he continued, "is inside the envelope. The storage unit itself requires a secondary key that is not with the attorney." He looked at her steadily. "It's been in this room the entire time." She looked at the room, at the monitoring equipment, the IV stand, the bedside table, the photograph on the table, a landscape, mountains, something he must have asked someone to bring him because the hospital hadn't provided it. The personal items drawer, now empty of the watch. "The photograph," she said. He nodded once. She picked it up carefully. It was mounted in a thin frame, the cheap kind you got at a drugstore, and when she turned it over, the backing panel was secured by 4 small clips. She released them. Behind the backing, taped flat, was a small brass key. She held it up. "Everything on that drive is original," he said. "Unedited. Full financial architecture, the shell companies, the billing processor relationships, the payment routing, internal communications between network principals going back 11 years, and a separate file with the names and credentials of every individual in oversight positions who received payments." He paused. 31 names across 5 states. 31. Not just the state board member in the photograph, a systemic corruption of the regulatory structure that was supposed to catch exactly what they were doing, built and maintained over more than a decade. "This is going to take years," she said. "Yes." He said it without apology or self-pity, just acknowledgement. "The cases that matter always do." He looked at his hands, a man's hands, older than they should have been for 61, marked by a life that had moved through harder places than hospital rooms. "I need you to understand something, Hart. The documentation I built, it's thorough. It will hold. but it's going to be contested, aggressively, by people with significant legal resources. They're going to look for every weakness, every gap, every possible challenge to the chain of custody and the sourcing. He met her eyes. Which means your testimony matters, not just about the chart, about all of it, about what you saw in this building and what you did about it and why. I know. You're going to be in rooms that are designed to make you feel small, he said, deposition rooms, hearing rooms, conference rooms full of expensive attorneys who are going to try to construct a version of Olivia Hart that is easier to dismiss than the real one. He paused. Don't let them. She looked at him for a moment. That's what I was going to tell you. He did smile then, a real one, brief and tired and genuine. Give the key to Castillo. Tell her about the attorney. He leaned back against the pillow. And then, for the love of everything, go sleep somewhere. She stood, held the key for a moment in her palm, small and ordinary, and carrying 9 years of documented truth inside whatever lock it fit. You're going to have to testify too, she said. I know. Your lungs will hold long enough. He said it with the flat certainty of a man who had decided. I didn't spend 3 years building this to let it fall apart because I'm too tired to finish it. She believed him. She gave the key to Castillo in the hallway outside the ICU and explained the attorney, the storage unit, the secondary key, and what Brewer had told her about the contents. Castillo listened without interrupting, made 2 calls before Olivia finished speaking, and had a federal team moving toward the commercial storage facility on the south side within 11 minutes. Then she went to find Marcus, borrowed his car keys, drove to her apartment 6 blocks from the hospital, and slept for 7 hours. The weeks that followed had the quality of something that happens in layers, each one revealing what was underneath, each layer more complicated than the one before it. The storage unit contained 4 external drives and 2 full binders of physical documentation. The federal analysts who processed the material described it, in the dry language of their field reports, as among the most thoroughly constructed evidence packages they had reviewed in the context of healthcare fraud investigation. Brewer had built it the way a careful person builds something they know they may not be alive to see used, with redundancy, with sourcing, with a clarity of organization that anticipated the challenges and answered them before they were raised. The network began to come apart at its edges first, as networks do. The 14 facilities varied in the depth of their involvement. Some had been active participants in the billing fraud for years, others had been brought in more recently, and 2 had been brought in without fully understanding what they were being brought into, which created a category of cooperative witnesses that accelerated the timeline of the broader investigation considerably. The billing processor at the center of the financial architecture, a company called Meridian Claims Management, headquartered in a glass office building 3 states away, was raided on a Tuesday morning 6 days after Stonebridge. Its principals were placed on administrative hold pending criminal investigation. Its financial records, when subpoenaed and examined, confirmed everything the drives contained and added detail in the form of internal email chains that were, in the words of one federal attorney, unusually direct for people engaged in sustained criminal activity. Warren Holt was charged with healthcare fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. His cooperation was noted in the charging documents but did not eliminate the charges, only positioned him for potential sentencing consideration contingent on the quality and completeness of his continued assistance. He resigned from Stonebridge Medical Center on the same day the charges were filed, a resignation that was technically voluntary and practically inevitable. He was 50 years old. He would not hold a position in healthcare administration again. Nolan Greer was charged with the same counts plus evidence tampering, with additional charges related to his role in directing the alterations to patient records. He did not cooperate. His attorney built a defense on procedural challenges and jurisdictional arguments, which bought time but not resolution. The trial was set for 14 months out, and everyone involved in building the case felt, in the specific way that people feel things when the evidence is this solid, that the outcome was a matter of when rather than whether. The state medical board member in the photograph, his name was revealed publicly in the charging documents as Aldous Venn, a man who had served on the board for 16 years and chaired its disciplinary committee for 9, was arrested on a Wednesday morning outside his home in a quiet suburb 40 miles from Stonebridge. The photograph of his arrest ran in 3 regional newspapers and 1 national outlet. He had no statement through his attorney except that he intended to vigorously contest the charges, which was the statement of a man who had no better option. The 31 names in Brewer's separate file were processed over the following 3 months. Not all of them resulted in criminal charges. Some were in jurisdictions where the evidence supported civil rather than criminal action, and some had technical defenses that reduced the exposure below the threshold for prosecution. But 24 of the 31 faced either criminal charges or professional sanctions or both. 11 medical licenses were revoked. 7 regulatory appointments were terminated. The infrastructure that had protected the network from oversight examination for nearly a decade was dismantled, one position at a time, with the public methodical thoroughness of institutions doing what they should have been doing all along. The 11 patients who had died, the ones Castillo had told Olivia about in the break room, in the careful language of documented adverse outcomes, received the hardest form of justice, which is the kind that comes too late. Their families were notified in the formal and inadequate language of legal process that investigations had determined their loved ones had received substandard care with documented deviations. Civil suits were filed. Most of those suits would settle before trial. No settlement would be adequate. Olivia knew this, and she sat with it, and she did not allow herself the comfort of deciding it was someone else's responsibility to carry. The 4 adverse outcomes at Stonebridge specifically, including the 2 deaths, were reviewed by an independent forensic medical panel appointed by the State Attorney General's office. The panel's findings, released 8 weeks after the initial investigation, were specific and unambiguous about the role of treatment deviations in 2 of the 4 cases. The families of those 2 patients received their notifications on the same day. Olivia read the panel report the night it was released, alone in her apartment, and she sat with those 2 names, people she had never met, whose charts she had never seen, who had been in this building before she arrived, for a long time. She gave her formal deposition 6 weeks after the night of the mass casualty event. The room was exactly as Brewer had described, designed to function like a space where the truth was just another variable to be managed, where expensive attorneys asked questions constructed to create the impression of ambiguity where none existed. They spent 40 minutes on her employment history, the gaps in it, the classified nature of her prior service. They spent 20 minutes on her relationship with Mays, implying a coordination that hadn't existed before that night. They spent an hour on the specific language of every report she'd filed, looking for inconsistencies between versions, finding none because she'd written every one of them with the understanding that inconsistency was a gift to the people she was writing against. She answered every question in the same register she'd used on the ER floor during the surge, level, precise, unhurried, without giving anything that wasn't asked for, and without withholding anything that was. The attorney across from her was very good, and she could see him recalibrating, halfway through, the way people do when they've prepared for one kind of witness and gotten another. After the deposition, in the hallway outside the federal building, Castillo found her. "You did well," Castillo said. "I told the truth. That's what doing well looks like in there." Castillo paused. "For what it's worth, and I know it's not worth much, given the circumstances. The work you did before any of this became federal business is the reason Brewer is still alive. The chart discrepancy reports you filed created enough scrutiny that whoever was managing his treatment had to be more careful than they would have been otherwise. We think that caution is what kept the interventions from escalating." Olivia looked at the building across the street, an ordinary Stonebridge afternoon going on around her. It wasn't enough to prevent the harm. No, it wasn't. Castillo said it plainly, without the cushioning that people sometimes applied to hard truths. But it was the difference between the harm that happened and worse harm. That matters, even when it doesn't feel like enough. It didn't feel like enough. Olivia had stopped expecting it to. The formal military recognition came on a Thursday in late November, 8 weeks after the night that had changed the shape of everything. It was not a large ceremony. Mays had asked her specifically how she wanted it handled, and she'd said small, and he'd made it small. A conference room at the federal field office, not a ballroom. 12 people in attendance, not 200. Mays presented the commendation himself, which was unusual, and he did it in the plain, direct language of someone who didn't believe in decorating facts. He described her service, the part of it that could be described without violating the classification that still governed the rest. and the action she'd taken in a classified operational context that had, in the assessment of the reviewing authority, demonstrated judgment and skill under conditions that most people didn't survive intact. He described the 14 months at Stonebridge and what she'd done there, which didn't require classified language because it was all on record and most of it was about to become public record anyway. Then he looked at her standing in front of 12 people in a federal conference room in a city that had not been kind to her, and he said, "The things you did in this building on the night of October 14th were not required of you. You had been terminated. You had every legal and personal justification to walk out those doors and not look back. The fact that you didn't, the fact that it didn't even appear to be a meaningful choice for you, is the most accurate summary of your character that I can offer." He placed the commendation in her hands. She looked at it for a moment, small and formal and carrying the weight of a system acknowledging what it had failed to acknowledge while it was happening. "Thank you," she said. Then, because she felt the room expected more, and because she was never going to be someone who gave a speech when the situation called for honesty, "I want to be clear that I didn't do what I did because I'm particularly noble. I did it because I couldn't not do it. There's a difference, and I think the difference matters." A few people in the room looked at each other. Mays looked at her with the not-quite smile. "The people who run operations like the one at Stonebridge," she continued, "count on the fact that most people can find a reason not to act. That reason is usually rational. It usually makes complete sense in the moment. It's usually the thing that protects your job and your stability and your sense of how institutional machinery is supposed to work. I understand why people make that choice. I've made it myself in other circumstances." She paused. "But at some point, the cost of the choice catches up to you. The sealed medication bag, the altered number, the patient in Bay 4 who nobody was watching. Those things have a cost whether you act on them or not. The only question is who pays it." She looked at the commendation in her hands. "I didn't want the patients of this network to pay it because I was afraid of what acting would cost me. That's all it was. That's not heroism. It's just a decision that someone has to make. And it might as well be made by the person who can see what's happening." The room was quiet. Mays said quietly, "It might as well be." Stonebridge Medical Center reopened under interim leadership 2 weeks after the federal investigation began, with a federal monitor embedded in the administrative structure and an independent patient safety board overseeing clinical operations. The interim director was a woman named Hara Solano, who had spent 20 years in healthcare regulation and had the particular kind of energy that came from being done with patients for the alternative. She called Olivia 3 days into her tenure. "I've read your employment file," Solano said, "both the version that was in the hospital's system and the more complete version that the Federal Review surfaced." "The hospital's version had some inaccuracies," Olivia said. "I noticed." A pause. "I'm not going to offer you your old position. Your old position was a function of an institutional structure that no longer exists." "I understand." "What I'm offering," Solano said, "is the Director of Patient Safety role. It's a new position. It doesn't exist yet in any formal sense. I'm building the infrastructure for it as part of the reform requirements under the Federal Monitor Agreement. The mandate is to build a clinical oversight system that makes what happened in this hospital structurally impossible going forward." Another pause. "I want someone in that role who understands both why it failed and what it takes to not fail when the institution is working against you." Olivia stood in her kitchen in the apartment 6 blocks from the hospital, looking out the window at the ordinary street, at the November morning and its bare trees and the traffic moving through it in both directions. "I'm not a director," she said. "You ran an ER floor through a mass casualty event on the night you'd been fired. You filed 7 formal reports against an institution that had every structural advantage over you, and you filed them correctly enough that they triggered a federal investigation." Solano's voice was dry and direct. "I'm not looking for a director. I'm looking for someone who understands what patient safety actually means at the level where it either holds or fails. Those are not the same thing, and you're one of the few people I've talked to who knows the difference." Olivia was quiet for a moment. "The patients who were harmed," she said, "the ones in the Stonebridge cases specifically. I want their files reviewed by an independent panel with full access to the original unaltered records. Not just the 2 deaths, all 4 adverse outcomes. And the findings have to be public. That's already part of the reform requirement. I want it to be part of the mandate of the position, separate from the federal requirement, something that exists because the institution decided it needed to exist, not because it was legally compelled to. A longer pause. I can do that. Then I'll take the meeting, Olivia said. I'm not saying yes to the role. I'm saying I'll come in and talk about what it would need to look like. That's all I'm asking. It took 2 meetings to get to yes, and the second one lasted 4 hours and covered ground that Solano had not expected to cover, which Olivia could tell from the way Solano kept revising the structure of the position as they talked, building it out from the initial concept into something more specific and more demanding. By the time they were done, it was a role that had never quite existed in any institution Olivia had heard of. Part clinical oversight, part investigative function, part patient advocacy, with a direct reporting line to the federal monitor that bypassed hospital administration entirely. It was not a comfortable position. Comfort had never been what she was looking for. She started in December. Clifton Brewer was discharged from Stonebridge Medical Center on a Friday in early December, 3 weeks after a surgical intervention on his left lung that bought him the breathing capacity his body had been slowly losing. He walked out of the building on his own, slowly, with a cane and an oxygen concentrator he was not happy about but had stopped arguing with. Olivia met him at the entrance. He looked at the building behind him with the expression of a man reviewing a long, complicated project. "Done," he said. "Not quite," she said. "Greer's trial is 14 months out. Ven's is being scheduled. The civil suits are going to run for years. The building part is done." He looked at her. "The rest is institutional. That runs on its own momentum now." She thought about that. The way a thing shifted from crisis to process, from emergency to procedure, from the night where everything was immediate and nothing was certain to the long, documented, unglamorous work of making it hold. "Testimony," she said. "When they need me, I'll be there." He looked at her with the directness she'd come to understand as his natural register. "You too." "Me too." He moved toward the car that was waiting for him. His attorneys, she thought, or someone connected to the federal protection arrangement that was still technically in place. He stopped at the edge of the sidewalk. "Hart." He didn't turn around. "You know what I noticed the first week you were in that room?" "Tell me." "You read the chart before you looked at the patient." He paused. "Most nurses, they look at the patient first, and that's right. That's the correct instinct, the human one. But you read the chart first because you already knew something was wrong with it, and you needed to know how wrong before you walked in." He turned his head, not quite looking at her. "You were protecting that man before you decided to, before you even knew you were doing it." She didn't say anything. "That's not a skill," he said. "That's a disposition. It's the thing that either got you into trouble your whole career, or it's the thing that made you useful." He started moving again. In this case, it was both. She watched the car pull out of the lot and merge into the ordinary traffic of a December morning, and she stood there on the sidewalk for a moment with the cold air on her face and the building at her back. The building that had fired her, that had tried to make her small and then discovered she was the wrong person for that, that was now going to be the place where she spent the next chapter of whatever she was doing. She thought about the 2 names. The patients. The ones she hadn't been able to reach in time, whose harm had been accumulating in altered records before she ever walked through these doors. She thought about the sealed medication bag and the number that didn't match, and the fact that she couldn't make herself walk past it. She thought about what it cost, in any institution, in any system, in any room where power has decided what the truth is. What it costs to be the person who looks at the thing everyone else has learned to not look at, and who keeps looking, and who writes it down, and who does not stop. The cost was real. She wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. You lost things. You lost comfort and certainty and the small daily peace of not being in conflict with the people who control your professional existence. You lost the version of yourself who might have had an easier time. She'd lost those things in a classified unit years before she'd ever lost them at Stonebridge, and she'd lost them at Stonebridge without fully deciding to, and she'd probably lose them again in whatever came next. But the sealed medication bag was still sealed. The number still didn't match. And somewhere in every institution, in every system that deals with human lives and human needs, there was a chart with a discrepancy and a patient in a bay that nobody was watching,
And the question was never really whether someone would eventually see it.
The question was whether the person who saw it would be the kind of person who kept looking. She went back inside. There was work to do. Some people spend their careers learning how to survive institutions. A few spend them learning how to make institutions survive the people they're supposed to serve. The difference between those two lives is not talent. It's not even courage, exactly. It's the willingness to believe when every practical signal says otherwise, that the number on the page should match the number in the lab, and that when it doesn't, that matters. It has always mattered. It will always be worth the cost of saying so.